Good morning. Well, it's season 3 of Coffee with Lisa, and I couldn't be more honored to have a really special guest with me and client, and who I consider a good friend, Michael Solomon. Michael Solomon is a professor at the university, a professor of marketing at St. Joseph's University, and really is considered the go-to person when it comes to consumer behavior. And he's wrote a number of books, has a new book that's come out that we're going to talk about. But without further ado, welcome, Michael.
Thanks, Lisa, and it's a real honor to be on your season debut. I appreciate that.
Well, thank you very much. You know what? It's been a while since I've done a Coffee with Lisa, and it was time to start back up again. You know what? COVID is like everybody else, was busy pivoting and adapting just like you have. I can't imagine what it's like for you in the classroom right now. Tell us a little bit about that from a professor's point of view.
Yeah, well, there's nothing pretty about it. Everybody is scrambling, to find a solution. No solution is as good as the old-fashioned, we used to say butts and seats. But, we are actually, I'm in Philadelphia. We are one of the few campuses left around here that is still making a go of it in the classroom. Of course, socially distanced, students with masks and all that. But at the same time, many of us, including myself, have basically half of the class on any given day in a traditional classroom, while the other half is listening in on Zoom, and then they take turns. So it's kind of like these disembodied voices are coming out of heaven, asking you questions. It's not a great solution, but teaching totally online didn't make me happy. We started doing that in March when everything hit, and we had to figure that out really quickly. So, everybody, you have to say that everybody's being very, what do they say? Necessity is the mother of invention. Everybody's trying to come up with solutions, and, hopefully, next semester will probably be the same, but hopefully the next academic year we'll all be back to doing what we like to do, which is really interacting with the students.
Yeah. Well, and interaction just looks differently now, right? Like, virtually is different. We can give an air hug. Ooh, I love the air hug.
Yeah,
but it's not quite the same as being in the room with each other.
Yeah.
And I can't, from a student's perspective, it's probably not that easy either. And although some probably thrive in the environment, there's others who wouldn't thrive in that type of environment.
Yeah, well, some of them love the idea of staying in bed and watching me on the screen without getting out of their pajamas. But you know what the hardest thing is? One of the hardest things, I think, and this is not just for teaching, but everyday life, is when you wear a mask. As you know, a lot of our communication is nonverbal.
Yeah.
And I'm looking out at a sea of masks, and I like to think of myself as being pretty funny in the classroom. I don't know if my students agree, but now I have no way of knowing if they're laughing at my jokes or frowning or
Yeah. Everybody has to, shake their body so they know they're laughing. Well, there are solutions. I mean, I've seen masks, where it's not the mask, it's the face shield.
Yeah.
But I've also seen they've come out with masks specifically for a solution for the hearing impaired, where they're, you can see through plastic, right?
Yeah.
But I can't imagine breathing into that every day, what that would be like. But,
yeah, it's hard enough wearing a regular mask and trying to lecture them, for an hour and a half or so at a time, keeping your voice at a much higher level. And it's not pretty. And I feel bad for the students. I've been doing this for 40 years, but this is their one shot to have the college experience. And I feel terrible for all of them. They're doing the best they can, and we all are. So
yeah, absolutely. Well, I just want to thank Denise for coming in. And it appears that StreamYard is actually the technology that we're using, but they're having trouble with Facebook bringing in actual users. So I love that somebody's here. I just don't know who you are, but hi as well. So if you can leave your name in the comments, then we can actually identify you in the show. But so let's talk a little bit. Tell us a little bit about how did you get to love marketing? How did you get into this world? And as a CMO, I mean, you're chief marketing officer. You've worked with companies like H&M, Under Armour, Levi. Like you worked with some big companies. Let's talk a little bit about you, the person. How did you get to be where you are today?
Well, it's a long story. I was born in a small log cabin in the woods. No, actually, I have kind of an unusual pathway because I was trained as a social psychologist. My PhD is in social psychology, but basically the short story is that I did my dissertation. I had been doing some research as a grad student on physical appearance and how that affects the way the different outcomes that people get, whether they're more or less likely to be hired, whether they're more or less likely to get a stiff prison sentence if they're good looking or not. And there's a lot of research on that. And basically what I realized at the time is that everybody, although there's tons of work done on that, great work done on that, it's almost all of it is from here to here. And almost nothing had been done on the body and what is on the body, specifically clothing. And so, much to the chagrin of my professors in grad school, I got a fashion designer to fund my dissertation, and I did my dissertation on the dress for success phenomenon, and basically was able to show in a laboratory setting using sort of, I guess you would say, scientific measures that indeed, when people are dressed more professionally in this particular case, it actually impacted their behavior. They were more assertive. They asked for higher salaries when they were in job interviews, and that was, kind of launched me on. I kind of had this epiphany, especially when I then went on to become a faculty member at New York University in the marketing department, not in the psych department, where they love this kind of stuff. And I realized that the everyday products that we use are, they seem kind of boring and mundane, but they are anything but. And they play a tremendous role in influencing not only how we think about other people, but also how we think about ourselves and literally how we behave. And so I started to do a lot of research. I worked with a number of apparel companies like Levi Strauss and Wrangler and Timberland, things like that. But I also expanded to look at other kinds of products. For example, the ways that we ornament our homes or even the cars we drive. And so I became more of a specialist, I guess you might say, on consumer lifestyles and brands, and really looking at what we do with brands every day. So not from the manager's perspective, but from the consumer's perspective.
Yeah. And so interesting story. So for those of you who don't know, Michael has been a client for some time, and we had an introduction done to a young lady in the marketing world, and it turned out that when she went to college or university, I can't remember which, she actually remembered you by the textbook that was used in her class. And so she was in very much I can't believe this. I'm working with my professor. So tell me, your textbook has impacted hundreds, if not thousands and thousands of students. How did you write a textbook that is in mainstream university? How does that happen?
Well, it happened many, many years ago. I'm already in the 13th edition of that particular textbook. I also have some others, but that's my favorite. And at the time, basically, and I hate to tell you when this was, it was back in the early 80s. You could tell by my gray hair. I'm not making this up. And basically at the time, the discipline that studies consumer behavior was going through kind of a revolution in the way that we looked at consumers. And actually, I was, I guess, in a small way, part of that. The research that I was doing was getting a lot more. It used to be that the field was dominated basically by economists and by certain kinds of psychologists that studied how we learn and so on. And that's great stuff. but they weren't looking so much at the social and cultural context of how we use products. And that's what we did to start to change the field. And basically, none of the textbooks reflected that exciting change, which frankly, I think is a lot more interesting to a lot of students, And so basically, I got an offer. I was approached by a publisher to write a textbook. And first I laughed quite a bit. And then I realized, well, you know what? I just got tenure. This is probably a good time to do it. And so I took a stab at it. It was a big gamble. The publisher took a big gamble because it was at the time, a very unorthodox approach. And it's funny that today, starting to work on the 14th edition of this book, and it's used around the world in different languages, etc. It's really considered to be mainstream. At the time, it was very revolutionary. And so it's been a lot of fun. Writing a textbook is a very, very interesting experience. And, basically it's, what I'll say is it's not nearly as easy as it looks. And basically what it involves is taking some very complicated ideas and describing them in a paragraph or two that a distracted 18-year-old can understand. Wow. And so that's almost good enough for an executive to understand.
So it's got to be simple but complex, in other words.
Exactly. Yeah.
And Larry, Larry's joining us, and Larry understands simple but complex. So anyways, well, so you have, I'm sure, let's get to the nitty-gritty of the conversation. I know you've got some great and valuable insights into consumer behavior that's been happening through COVID. I mean, there has been all kinds of, data and revelations and pivots and adapting. And one of the things that you talk about in your recent Forbes article was about gas. So I want to talk about gas. And so if those of you don't know, and it's not the gas that you pick up your leg and you let go. It's a different kind of gas. So let's talk a little bit about gas. And Kathleen is asking you to mention the title of your textbook.
Oh, the textbook is called Consumer Behavior: Buying, Having, and Being.
And you know what, Kathleen, what we'll do is after the show, I'll actually put the link to the textbook down below. But if you actually do a Google search for Michael R. Solomon, the textbook comes all over in 1,000 different editions in multiple languages. So it's really easy not to miss.
Yeah, and when you find the Canadian version, Lisa, for you, there's a big difference because behavior is spelled with a U in it.
Of course. She said, thank you.
Yeah.
You're welcome, Kathleen.
So you want to know about stepping on the gas.
Let's talk about gas, but the really good stuff that helps us.
All right. Well, as you mentioned, I do write for Forbes occasionally. And so I wrote an article recently called The New Normal. And gas is just an acronym that I use because what I said is basically in times of crisis, first of all, it's not that things change overnight. It's that things that were changing already get kind of a kick in the pants, and they get these changes accelerate. So things that were happening already get accelerated. A couple of examples would be, for example, the demise of department stores, unfortunately, and the so-called retailing apocalypse that was well underway before COVID ever hit. But of course, COVID was kind of the final straw for a lot of great retailing institutions. So there's lots of things like that are happening. And people, what I proposed in that brief article is that there are three basic drivers that are going to influence a lot of people's consumption behaviors and purchasing behaviors, both during COVID and afterwards. Because what happens is in a big event like this, the way I often talk about this in my keynotes and so on is that you want to think about society like a block of ice, right? So it's frozen in shape. And what that means is that as consumers, for the most part, we're frozen in shape. That is, we're set in our ways. Now and then we like to try new things, some of us more than others. But as any brand that's, smaller brand, and some of the companies you work with that try to break in, understand it's very difficult to get people to change their ways when they're happy with something, because we're all lazy, to some extent. But every now and then a big event occurs that's kind of like this, the sun, like global warming, I guess you would say, that starts to melt that ice. And so what happens is our habits start to unfreeze. And now we're in a more fluid period.
Right.
Continuing with that water metaphor, we're in a fluid period where we're suddenly much more receptive to doing things in new ways and trying things that we hadn't wanted to try before. Whether it's an elbow bump instead of a handshake, or whatever it is, or new brands, ordering more, grocery shopping online where we didn't consider doing that before. And so what I like to tell marketers, managers, is that now it's not all doom and gloom. I mean, lots of it is, but it's also the time. This is an opportunity because now your customers are unfrozen. They're willing to try new things. And then what's going to happen is over time, that ice will refreeze in the same way that this awful, pandemic is going to go away. When the ice refreezes, now we're back to where we were, but we're in a new shape now, right? Because the water has refrozen. And what that means is that a lot of the habits that we picked up during that unfreezing period now become the new normal. Right. And so now is the time in the kind of intermediate period where, as a marketer, you want to get in there where people genuinely are receptive to trying new things because the old things don't work or they can't get them or what have you. So what I talked about, getting back to this idea of gas. So first I had water, now I have gas. I don't know. Maybe I should have been a physicist or something, but I'm definitely not. So the three drivers that I talked about that influence a lot of things that people are looking for are very simple. GAS: gratification, agency, and stability.
Right.
Okay, so I can go through those quickly if you'd like.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk a little bit more, because I think it's important for people to really understand, because we're all pivoting and adapting. And like you said, our good friend Adam Vasquez would say, it's time for market invention right now. Absolutely. And so, what is GAS and how do we apply it into our businesses?
Yeah, sure. So the first letter, G, is gratification. Very simply, we all want to feel good. Lots of us are not feeling real good right now. We're not feeling love. We can make light of it, but there's a lot of depression and obviously financial issues for many people. So the question is, how can we gratify that basic desire just to feel good during the day? Yeah. In light of the fact that, unfortunately, many of us have a lot of economic instability, emotional instability, et cetera. So people are finding new ways to do that, Zoom happy hours. I don't know if that works or not. But one thing that I can suggest as an example is to focus on kind of having your cake and eat it too. So let's say that you're a fashion brand and you make fairly upscale stuff, whether it's fragrances or dresses or whatever. And I do a lot of work with the fashion industry. Really, really bad times right now, of course, because people aren't spending a lot on these expensive garments necessarily. So what can you do in the meantime? Well, one thing you can do is to say, well, so for example, let's say I'm Chanel, and I've got customers that in normal times would think nothing about plunking down $300 or what have you for a little bottle of fragrance to have that Chanel experience. Yeah. They don't want to do that right now, but Chanel also sells a little bar of soap for $29 US, and says Chanel on it. And so this idea of affordable luxury, affordable fashion is something that we're starting to hear about. Is that a permanent solution? No, because Chanel is not going to make tons of money in the long term by just selling little bars of soap. But it's a way to keep your customers engaged with your brand during this period. So for example, a lot of companies, what they can do is, let's say you're gonna make a food product, or you're a winery or something.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, how do you apply that principle to a different industry, a different vertical?
Yeah, well, you know that people are spending lots of time on Zoom calls. Maybe they're running out of things to say. But for example, send out a sample pack. Let's say you're into wine, okay, or cheese, right? Yeah. Send out a sample. Let's say you're going to do a cheese tasting with your friends. So I'm a cheese company, right? So I prepare a little sample pack of these different cheeses, little bite-sized, the way you would do it at a real, in the old days. And everybody, let's say I got 10 people on the call, every one of them gets in the good old-fashioned mail a little sample pack. And then simultaneously, you have someone who takes them through that cheese tasting. Now try number 5, and everybody talks about that. And you can do that if you think about a lot of direct selling companies that have, like Tupperware and Amway and Mary Kay and so on. I work with some of those companies. They're doing really well right now.
Yeah.
Because those home parties, the old-fashioned Tupperware parties, when they migrate online, which they were doing before the pandemic anyway, this is a great way for people to have a sense of community, to try new things, but not break the bank. So that's a quick example of gratification.
Yeah. Yeah.
Moving on to the agency. So in psychology land, agency means having control over your outcomes. We want to feel that we're in control. In the pandemic, we're not. People feel a sense that they're losing control, especially when they leave their homes, because they don't know what they're going to encounter, right? And so there's a lot of uncertainty. So what you're seeing is that anything that can restore a sense of control within your boundaries, at least within your little castle, is really, really valuable. So when the pandemic first started, there were 2 words that everybody said: toilet paper, right? There was a lot of hoarding going on. People were buying just cartons, more than they could ever use.
It was so ridiculous.
Right?
Like,
why were they doing that? Well, I think it's for this reason, because if they could get it, if they could maintain their home inventories, not just of that, but also of cleaning supplies and masks and what have you, then they know that as long as they're locked inside their little castle there, they're in control. And so for example, if you sell anything that has to do with home organization, if you're like the Container Store or Tupperware, for example, where
you think about Home Depot.
Home Depot
have record sales.
Absolutely. All that stuff is going through the roof.
Yeah.
And so and home furnishings are going through the roof, So there's an example of agency, of allowing people to have a sense of control. Now, when they go outside, they still may not know what they're going to encounter, especially if they go into a crowded restaurant and everybody's without masks and all that. That's what freaks people out. So the idea is that your home is your castle, but now really, really it is. So that's an example of agency. Okay. The letter S, stability. Kind of similar. We want to feel a sense of familiarity and predictability in our lives. Usually we have these routines, that ice that I was talking about. All that goes away when we don't know. Every day we wake up to kind of a different world. So anything that reminds us of the good old days when things were normal, if they ever were, and predictable, is really valuable. So I'll give you a piece of evidence for this from the food industry. We know that food sales in general are also doing very well. Of course, unfortunately, because people aren't going out to restaurants.
Yeah.
But what kinds of foods are doing particularly well? Comfort foods, mac and cheese, things like that, cereals, baked beans, all of those things that remind us of earlier times when we were happy and safe. And if you look at the sales of those things, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. So anything you can do that provides stability and familiarity. And so, for example, even in normal times, if you think about nostalgia, right? You know what nostalgia is. It's kind of a bittersweet longing for the past.
Yeah.
Well, in a normal year, roughly 10% of all advertisements have a nostalgia appeal.
Right.
Very common because it works super well. Because what they'll do is they'll play a song that was popular during your senior year of high school, and you probably don't remember all the bad stuff. You remember the good stuff. And so you have this warm, fuzzy feeling, and that now transfers onto the product. Very simple.
Yeah. Yeah.
So nostalgia is something that provides a sense of familiarity. So if you happen to have a product where you can use a nostalgia appeal, that's something that's going to provide that stability. Anything that reminds us of the good old days of a year ago. So that's, in a nutshell, that's what I'm talking about. Now, are those the only three things? Probably not. But when you look and in the article, I give some examples for each of those of products and services that can take advantage of gratification, agency, or stability.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, and it's interesting because that you bring up nostalgia because, when you talk about mac and cheese and beans and so forth, I would imagine that price has something to do with that as well because people are budget constrained. But it's interesting that you talk about nostalgia because it'll be, in a year from now, it will be very interesting to see some of the data and statistics that comes out around people feeling like they have a sense of belonging, that people feel like they're closer to their family, the experiences that have occurred because, you no longer have the travel budget, or you are not allowed to travel. And so people are spending money differently than they normally would. So here at home, I have friends and they own a dealership for ATVs and skidoos and stuff. And their business is insane right now because people are taking the budget that they had for travel outside of the country and are actually buying things that allow them to have family experiences. And so teams and businesses are doing the same as well, right? It's an adaptation. So how does behavior affect internally a business when it comes to the consumer products? And Lori is actually asking for the article link. Lori, it's in Forbes, and if you look up Michael R. Solomon, it's the first thing that comes up under Forbes. It's his most recent article, and I believe it came out in June, correct?
I think earlier, maybe it may have been April. I hate to say,
or April.
But
okay.
You'll find it. You'll find
it. And if you would do us a huge favor, Lori, if you just want to share it in the stream, that would be fantastic for everybody else.
Yeah. So this is a great question you're asking, Lisa, and you used a really important word as you were leading up to it that I'm going to use to answer your question, and that word is community.
Yeah.
And this is one of those things about products that when you asked me early on, what brought you into marketing, what you see is that these even everyday products, I like that comment.
I don't know who it is. I think they're inside my group, and that's why. You have to get StreamYard permission, but I wish I knew who it was.
All right, step on the gas. When you look at a lot of everyday products and you ask yourself, why are people so attached to them? It's because those products create connections to our lives that we often take for granted. I mentioned I used to do a lot of work with Levi Strauss, and I'll give them a free commercial because one of the reasons that brand is so strong is that people have these, and what I found in my own research that I did for them, people have these amazing connections with a product like the 501s, the basic button fly jean. People used to, and I had the opportunity to go to their headquarters in San Francisco. I saw this for myself. People used to send boxes with their old nasty jeans in them. And they would say, I can't wear these anymore, but they mean so much to me. Would you make sure they get a proper burial? And they would send them back to heaven, which was their corporate headquarters in San Francisco.
Like that gives me goosebumps, truly, if you could see the goosebumps on my arm. Now that is what I would call brand loyalty.
Absolutely. That's the holy grail. And there's some, my mantra is, and my students are sick of my saying this, I say it almost every day. People don't buy products because of what they do. They buy them because of what they mean. Yeah. And so you can have 5, 10 products in a category that are functionally pretty much the same. And you may not think that your brand is functionally the same, but you talk to customers and they'll tell you, yeah, they're all pretty much the same, which is maddening if you're a brand manager. But what you'll find is that 1 or 2 of those brands are head and shoulders above the others. And the reason is not because they do the function better. I mean, they have to perform that way. Yeah. But the reason is that they're telling a story that people are resonating with.
Yeah.
So you take your usual suspects, you know, your Apple, your Harley Davidson, your Nike, all of these. The reason that, you know, people are going to die for these products, it's not because they're, you know, they're connecting them to the web, to a website or something like that. It's because of the stories that are around it. And so the companies that are successful understand that it's all about brand storytelling. And that is the connection, you know, that's the glue that holds us to products. And so it doesn't just have to be a super expensive, you know, luxury product
Yeah.
to have a great story. And that's why I mentioned Levi Strauss, because even though they've gone up in price, they're still relatively, you know, inexpensive compared to a lot of other blue jean, you know, brands.
Yeah.
And they're not the only ones that do this, but they do it really well. And so no matter what category you're in, and this is true of services too, by the way, not just of products, you'll find that, you know, whenever you have a product like Apple, where people are literally willing to wait in a snowstorm lined up around the Apple store, you know, around the block. I mean, here we had the mayor of Philadelphia waiting in a snowstorm to get a new iPhone, you know. When he could have gotten that phone 3 days later, would be delivered by FedEx, you know. You've got an amazing thing there. Now, not every brand can get to that level of devotion, but many brands that are at the other level, we call that inertia, where people are just buying it out of habit. They can easily be dissuaded by, let's say, a better price from a competitor. You can move those people if you want to think about a continuum of involvement with the product. So at one level, at one end, it's inertia, where people really don't care at all. It's just a carton of milk, I don't care.
Yeah.
And at the other end, we can think about cult products that really are almost like a religion. When we study them, they have a lot of characteristics with a religion. People worship their Nikes and their Apples and all that, you know. Well, most products are somewhere in the middle toward the inertia end. And there are so many ways that, you know, if you're a good marketer, you don't necessarily change what the product does, but you change what it means by involving people in various ways. And I talk about this a lot in, you know, various things that I've written and companies that I've worked with, by moving the dial, you know, and getting people to understand that they're more involved. I'll give you a quick example that just came to mind. There's a cult brand. There's a beverage called Jones Soda. I don't know if you ever heard of it, Jones Soda. Yeah. So one of the things they did, you know, they're never going to be, at least in our lifetimes, you know, the Coca-Cola of the world. But what do? They do lots of things to make people feel like they identify with that brand. And one of the things that they did, I'm not sure if they are still doing it, but I know that you could send your picture to them and they would send you back bottles of the soda with your picture or a picture of your girlfriend or whoever on there. Now, how about that as a way to personalize a brand and make it something that is a part of you? M&M's does the same thing, right? You can little chocolate candy, it's a nothing, right? But you can put your name on it. You know, I could have a bag of Lisa candy, and suddenly it becomes something a lot different than just a bag of candy. So,
Absolutely.
you know, when people tell me, "Oh, my product is too boring," you know, I say, you know what? There's a lot of people out there with products that are even more boring than yours that have done a great job of being much more creative and understanding how to link this to what we would call the higher order needs of the customer.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. So I have a new show coming out actually. Tomorrow is my first show, and it's called Wine Wednesdays Business Uncorked. And I'm co-hosting with the gentleman who has had 40 years in the culture space, Lauren Rubis. And one of our guests over the next couple of weeks is Gary Ridge. And Gary Ridge is the chairman and CEO of WD-40. And your story about creating experience. So I don't know if you know too much about the WD-40, but Gary came out with an article recently, and it was about a story about a man who was a customer of WD-40. And what he did was he had to use the WD-40, and I don't remember what it was for off the top of my head, but he needed to use the WD-40. And so he took his daughter with him to, you know, fix whatever it was. And he created an experience around the sense of smell. And this was really interesting because what he did was he associated the sense of smell. So he had the rag and the WD-40, and the daughter smelled the WD-40 on the rag, and they fixed it was, and they had a moment of bonding. But the daughter will now, for the rest of her life, will remember the smell of W40 and equate that smell to the experience of fixing something with her father.
Yeah.
And, I think as a child, the smell of diesel will never leave me, because diesel reminds me of filling up the tractors, on the farm and getting ready to go to the field. Right. And so I think that when you start to associate your senses, like you're talking about, with the experience and with your product, and now WD-40 is not it's not anything glitzy. It's not a Coach handbag or whatever,
Right.
But it's interesting. So what's your opinion about activating different senses around your brand?
Oh, that's it's almost like I snuck you that question, but I didn't.
No, you didn't.
So I've written a lot about what you're talking about is what's called sensory marketing.
Yeah.
It's very powerful. And one of the things to remember is that, which most marketers forget, is that we have 5 senses, but the visual is, 95% of the marketing communications that go on are visual.
Yeah.
And, shapes, colors, packages, faces, all of that. And the problem is that there's so much competition to get into the consumer's head through the visual channel, because each of us, believe it or not, Lisa, receives somewhere between 3,500 to 5,000 commercial messages a day. Now, the large majority, you say, well, I haven't seen even 1,000, but the reason for that is the large majority of those, your brain is just not processing, is not capable of processing.
Yeah. Yeah.
But so think about it, like imagine a line of people lining up at the main gate to get into a concert. But it turns out that there's other entrances around the side that nobody knows about, and you can go right in,
Yeah.
So your other senses are like that. And the sense of smell happens to be the most powerful because it is linked to our reptilian brain, actually.
Yeah.
It's the most fundamental sense, even more than vision, that we have. And so indeed, you're starting to see more and more companies that are developing a signature scent. A lot of hotel chains. Be careful when you walk into the lobby of a big hotel. Smell around the lobby, because you're often gonna detect a scent where if you went to that same hotel in Tokyo, you would smell the same thing.
Yeah.
And so that's being used very, very powerfully. But the other senses as well. The sense of touch is probably the least used. And of course, hearing. We're seeing more and more so-called audio branding, where companies like, Intel is famous for that, but certain companies that might have a jingle or a certain sound that is linked to it. So the point is, even if you're a small guy and you can't compete with Coca-Cola on network television, be creative. Don't abandon the sense of sight. I'm not saying that, but supplement it with these other things to create what we would call a brand identity or a brand personality that actually is functioning using more than one of the senses.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. So Gary Vaynerchuk, if you watch any of Gary Vaynerchuk's videos, and in the first, I think it's the first 6 or 9 seconds, and I don't remember off the top of my head, but he actually inserts his logo with a ping and like a very specific sound, so he's activating, it's brilliant marketing, because he's finding a way to activate the sound and you to recognize his video by the sound acuity of this ping, right? And of course, his logo is attached to it. So, but and
by the way, the reason that stuff works, it's based on the same. I hate to tell you this, but it's based on the same principles that we use to train our pets. To train mice to run through a maze, and these strong basic connections. And you could do it with almost anything. And in Japan, believe it or not, you can buy a cologne that smells like a Whopper of meat.
Yeah.
So we can, you can bottle almost anything and make it yours.
Wow. Yeah, I don't think I want to walk around smelling like a Whopper. I'm not sure
idea.
what would be the motivation or the intention, if you will, behind that? But
Oh,
yeah,
it makes people hungry, you know.
I guess
Or it gets them woken up. I don't know.
now I guess if I owned a bit like a Burger King or
Right.
then I could see myself running
There you
around
go.
with the perfume of a Whopper, but I don't know
Yeah.
otherwise.
Well, we'll have to develop a Lisa Patrick scent then.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if anybody wants to run around like me, but anyways, each to their own, I suppose. Well, very good. So, one last piece of advice for anybody really who's trying to interrupt the market right now, and really change the way their brand is inviting consumers to engage with them. What would that be?
Well, you know, uh, the thing you got to do is you can't sit in your office and imagine what it would be. You have to go out. If you want, you got to fish where the fish are. And I
Yeah.
tell managers this all the time. You can't use your own assumptions about what would work because your customers may.
Yes.
One thing I found in working with a lot of companies is they often have in their minds the customer they want to have rather than the customer they actually have.
Yeah.
And so they do things to appeal to that customer that would appeal to them. But the reality is they may or may not be similar to their customer. And so if you want to know what's going to really float people's boat, ask them and
Yeah.
observe them. Go out and just walk around, see how people are using your product. And you'll often be surprised because they're often using it in ways that you never imagined. And so that co-creation process is so important today, not only for developing new products, but involving your customers in every phase. Your customers are your best marketers. They're your best sales force. If they love you, they'll tell everybody about it. Unfortunately, if they hate you, they'll tell even more people. They are great for new product development. They might even be retailers, like someone who is a distributor, let's say for Mary Kay, something like that. They're advertisers today. They're posting ads all the time about your products. And most managers, I say to them, are you aware that there's 100 websites about your brand that are not created by your company? And they say, what? And once you go out and see that and see the discourse that people are actually having, not the people that work for you, you get a totally different perspective on it. And that's how you get people engaged, is by speaking their language, not forcing them to speak your language.
Absolutely. Well, and it's, when I'm working with my clients, when we're talking about their personal brands and, trying to drive business, and lots of times they say, well, I'll make a recommendation. They say, well, no, nobody wants to hear that about me, or from me about that particular topic. And my question is always back to them is, well, what makes you think that? Well, I just know my customer. Actually, you don't know your customer until you start to put it out there and start to get the data back and let the data make the decision, not what you believe is the reality. And I see that happen lots with people who create courses, right? Online courses, is they believe the customer wants to know more about this particular expertise or this particular topic. And then they find out actually that wasn't what they wanted at all. They wanted to know more about this. Yeah. And so, it's important to talk to your customers, and it builds brand loyalty. It really does. Yeah.
Well, it's what we sometimes call the IKEA effect. And what that means is that in a general sense, when people are involved in building or putting together the products or services they buy, they're much more attached to them. I mean, for me, with IKEA, there's always a screw left over, but that word
do that purposefully. I'm sure that's with intention.
but that is, when you ask people for their input and they give it to you, then they're invested in you.
Yeah.
Because a part of what you're doing now has their DNA in it. Yeah. And it amazes me how many companies want to keep their customers at a distance, until everything is absolutely perfect.
Yeah.
And that is so not the way to do it. Yeah.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Well, and it's interesting because people now, like, you talked about, people don't buy the product because of what it does for them. They buy it because of what they, how it makes them feel, or, it's an emotional attachment
Yeah.
not clearly, I mean, if you need a plunger for your toilet, you need a plunger for your toilet. It's kind of hard to get emotionally attached to the plunger of a toilet that's, taking the crap out of your toilet. But having said that, there's still, you need to be attached to the brand, the mission, the vision, the goal. People want to belong to something more than that's greater than themselves.
Absolutely. And I should note that if that plunger doesn't work, you're going to have some strong feelings about that brand.
Exactly. And it's not the gas that we were talking about earlier either. So, Michael, to close the show up, you've got a new book called The New Chameleons.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, what I do in this book, and I started this before the pandemic, but I think it's even more relevant now. There's a lot of very basic assumptions that marketers make about customers. Many of those involve putting their customers into little categories. And we get a lot of comfort from that. So what do I mean by categories? Well, market segmentation, kind of marketing 101. Are your customers rich or poor, male or female? Do they live here or do they live here? That basic logic no longer really works in a lot of cases because we're able to fine tune our strategies to a much greater degree where we can literally market to markets of one, using social media and so on. So what I do in the book is, I use the word chameleon because the modern consumer is someone who changes their color constantly. In other words, we're no longer like back, say, in the 1950s, you were pretty predictable. Your lifestyle was pretty predictable. Market segmentation worked pretty well. But today, we're always trying on new identities, either because of our access to other people on the internet or just when we walk around, in normal times, go to the mall, go to a food court and try food from a different country, whatever it is. Yeah. And so these consumer chameleons, the subtitle is How to Connect with Consumers Who Defy Categorization. And so we have these basic categories. One of them, for example, is male versus female. So you either make male products or female products. But when you look particularly at younger consumers today, many of them do not think in terms of a binary distinction between male and female. Older people have trouble with that sometimes, but we can see this with androgynous fashions. We see that there's a lot of fluidity, a lot of popular culture now talking about whether they're transgender people or other many different definitions of what gender you are. And so companies that think they're only targeting to the traditional male or the traditional female really are missing the boat. And so what I do is in every chapter, I talk about a different basic assumption or dichotomy that we use, and I kind of tear it apart. So another, for example, is people versus machines. So increasingly, that's not a relevant distinction, as many of us have, for example, robotic parts in our bodies, or we have dental implants, we have contact lenses that detect saline concentration. We're all wearing wearable watches and on and on. And so, and on the other hand, you've got robots that are starting to be working in retail settings and in manufacturing settings. And so that distinction between flesh and blood and robots is really no longer very relevant. I mean, Saudi Arabia granted citizenship to a robot a couple of years ago. So this whole revolution is really upending a lot of our traditional assumptions, but it also creates a lot of opportunities for marketers that say, I'm not going to just look either here or there. So a quick example of that in the fashion area that I like to talk about is you had two categories for women's fashion for years and years. One of them was athletic wear and one of them was leisure wear.
Yeah.
Neither of them was doing a whole lot. Then a few people had this great idea. What if we make a hybrid? What if we make a merger of those two and sort of capitalize on this whole yoga craze and all that? So, the owners of Lululemon, for example, and some others actually created a new category called athleisure, which is going through the roof, especially now with the pandemic.
Yeah.
So when you look in a lot of different verticals, what you see is that every business uses certain labels to talk about their customers and their products, and they think they're just competing against other members of that subcategory. If they can take themselves out of that, or open the cage, as I would say in the book, they can see these opportunities, because customers today do not want to be put into categories.
Yeah.
And every one of us, everybody who's watching this show might say, yeah, I can do that for other people, but myself, I'm a little bit of this, a little bit of that. You can't just say I'm a 35-year-old woman, blah, 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 because I'm different from that other 35-year-old woman. So it's okay for everybody else, but not for me. And that is the mindset of the consumer today. Many marketers are, we were all raised with this. This is how we train our students. Let's assign them labels, and then everybody in a label gets the same treatment.
Yeah.
That's marketing 101. And I'm guilty of that when I teach my MBA students that. But that is not the way the world is working, and what I would call the postmodern world, where we're going beyond these categories. And that's what the book is about.
Well, I would love a copy. So I'm going to where can we buy it? Amazon?
It's actually, it's not available until early next year, but it's published by Kogan Page. And there's a link that I think you had somewhere. If anyone's interested, they can place a pre-order and get a 20% discount. And then they'll get the book. Yeah, there it is.
There it is.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Good. It's good to hear. All right. So it was an absolute pleasure to see you again, as always. Kicking off my season 3 of Coffee with Lisa. It'll be available on iTunes here over the next couple days. What I loved about this show was the fact that we talked about, and I talk a lot about, how to be distinctively unforgettable. And, your work feeds into that. And so thank you very much, because I think it's important that people need to understand that in order to really, truly make an impact with your products and your services, you have to inspire people to feel and have an experience with it first and foremost.
Absolutely.
And that's how you become distinctively unforgettable.
And I can, at least I've known you for several years, I can say that you are distinctively unforgettable. And I really appreciate being on the show.
Thank you. Well, and there's much more to come with Michael Solomon. I have a Facebook group called Be Distinctively Unforgettable. Please join it. And you never know, Michael might be one of the special guests in there. So thank you, Kathleen, for tuning in, and for Lori for tuning in, and for Stan for tuning in, and everybody else. So we have a bunch of Facebook users that we have no idea who they are because the platform is not working properly. But anyways, thank you very much, Michael. Stay healthy. Hopefully soon you'll be back in the, everybody will be back with you in your classroom.
I hope so.
And not online.
Yeah.
Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye now.
Bye.